Good evening, everybody, and welcome back to the Spooky Mom Show. I'm your host, the Spooky Mom, and on tonight's episode, we're going to dive into the Baldoon Mystery. The Baldoon settlement is located somewhere near present-day Wallaceburg, Ontario. And the reason this story is so special to Canadians is because it is a 200-year-old mystery that has never been solved. This story revolves around the MacDonald family. They originally came from Scotland to the Baldoon settlement for the promise of a better life, but when Baldoon settlement failed, they decided to stay and they bought a plot of land with a house on it. So the MacDonalds moved into this house, and right away they started to notice things that were eerily mysterious and odd, things that couldn't be explained. For instance, there was a day when all the women were working in the barn bundling hay, when all of a sudden the beams from the rafters came loose and came down directly in between the circle of women, impaling themselves into the ground. When the men came to inspect, there was no rhyme or reason why those beams should have fallen, as they were very securely in place. Flash forward a few days later, 3 men were standing in the front of the hearth. There was a baby in the cradle, and all of a sudden the cradle decided it was going to rock violently. The 3 men panicked and they ran. They put their hands on the cradle trying to force it to stop because it was scaring the child, but it wouldn't stop. Eventually the 3 of them took their hands off the cradle and they backed away in fright, and all of a sudden the cradle stopped moving just as quickly as it had started. The mother came in, scooped up the baby, and the cradle was immediately burned. There were accounts by the family that late at night they would describe what they heard as foot soldiers marching through their kitchen. So with candlesticks and lanterns in hand, they would get up to go and inspect. But when they went into the kitchen, the sound would stop, and there was nothing there. There was no army marching through their kitchen. So they would all go back to bed, and a few days later, the same thing would happen. The scariest thing, I would think, that happened to this poor family at this house that they had purchased is the fact that bullets and sticks and stones were thrown at the outside of the house. It got to a point where this became a nightly occurrence, where stones and bullets were being thrown. The next day, the family would go out and they would gather up all the stones and bullets, and they would put special markings on them, and then they would walk it off the property and throw it into the nearest creek bed. And then that same night, those same bullets and those same stones with the special markings on them would come flying through their windows and start hitting and pelting the sides of the house. And yet again in the morning, they would gather it all up, walk it off the property, and throw it into the river. And then the next night, the same thing. This went on for 3 years. Eventually, the MacDonalds got fed up, and John MacDonald, the father, had his father from the old world, who lived down the road in another farmhouse. So at one point he packed up his family and he went there thinking that whatever was going on was particularly tied to the land and the house, or so they had hoped. But unfortunately, when they went to stay with his father, the ghostly apparitions, the plaguing rocks and bullets followed them. So after some time being spent at his father's place, they decided to go back to the house. But instead of staying in the house, they were going to stay in a tent, thinking that that might help. It did not. So John MacDonald boarded up all the windows. He stopped replacing the glass, but yet every night it sounded like a hailstorm being pelted on the outside of the house by rocks and bullets. At one point, fires started erupting on the property, and when they put one out, 12 more would start in its place. The problem with this is that there was no ignition source. They couldn't explain why the fires were starting or what was going on. So after a time, John MacDonald went into town and he sought out a local priest who had experience in exorcisms. The priest came to the house, he said his blessings, and went on his way. Now, unfortunately for the MacDonald family, after the priest had said his blessings, it must have disturbed something because the activity in the house and outside of the house picked up exponentially, and the family was plagued even more. So, at his wits' end, John MacDonald had heard of a woman with the gift of second sight. So he packed up his family once more, and he sought out this woman. When he found her, she told him that there was a curse that had been placed on him and his family by an old woman who he had had a spat with. Now, the woman who supposedly placed the curse on him had cursed a black goose, and the soothsayer had told him, "You must shoot the goose with a silver bullet if you want the curse to end." So they go back home, and they fashion a bullet out of pure silver, and there was a black goose on the property. They shot it in its right wing. A few days after that, the woman who originally had the spat with the MacDonald family and allegedly put the curse on them was seen with her right arm in a sling. Now, I'm not saying that curses are real, but whatever plagued the MacDonald family, it was bad enough that the family just up and left, because shortly after that black goose was shot, the activity had stopped. We're not sure why, but the family was being left alone. Now, in the 1930s, that house burned to the ground and there's nothing left on the property. I think you might be able to still see the old barn that was there where the beams came loose and impaled into the ground. But still to this day, near Wallaceburg, Ontario, people claim to see ghostly apparitions on the property. They claim to see ghost fires, hear footsteps, voices, all kinds of paranormal activity. People come from all around to see this place because still to this day, nobody knows what happened. I hope you enjoyed this story, and as always, stay spooky. Spooky Mom loves you. Take care of each other and yourself.